Hi everyone, welcome to another testing and evaluation in English video. So today is going to be part one of two parts in which we talk about some key principles of assessment. So here we go, gonna jump right in. Okay, so the topic of this chapter is called Principles of Language Assessment. Now, these principles are key. And we're going to be talking about two types of exams. So we're going to be talking about more standardized exams, but only a little bit. Mostly we're going to be focused on the classroom assessments that you will use in the future and how these principles are really important. In future videos, future chapters, future classes, we're going to try to show how you can make sure that you use these principles or pay attention to these principles when you create your own classroom tests. Okay, so here we go. So the learning objectives for the whole chapter is, first of all, to understand the 5 major principles of language assessment. And we're going to give some examples. Then you're going to give examples, or you should learn how to give examples to support or not support the principles. Then you should also learn how to show the importance of each principle based on different contexts. So do I care about, for example, one of the principles is called reliability. Do I care about reliability in my weekly quiz? Or do I care about authenticity when I'm testing a certain thing? Okay, and then the last one is to be able to apply these principles to your own classroom practices. Okay, so let's start. The very first principle is called practicality. Now, this one should be kind of commonsensical in the fact that, is your test practical? Okay, so what constitutes practicality? So I like to start with the quote from the textbook. And it says, practicality refers to the logistical, down-to-earth administrative issues. Now, when we're talking about administrative, we're talking about administering the test, giving the test. So administrative issues involved in making, giving, and scoring an assessment issue. All right, so let's get a little bit more practical here in terms of the definition. So first of all, does your test meet the approved budget? Now, if it's a classroom test, probably this is not something you're going to have to deal with unless you're talking about copying. Maybe you only have so many copies you're allowed to make. So maybe making a test that's 50 pages long could be a little bit impractical. Okay, the second is you should allow the test taker enough time to successfully complete the test. Okay, so you don't want to give a test and have it take 2 hours when you only have a 40-minute time period. That's not practical. Okay, the third, the directions for actually administering the test, giving the test to your students, they're clear. So you as a teacher or whoever's helping knows how to actually give the test in a way that allows the test takers to succeed. Okay, human resources are utilized in an appropriate manner. Again, this is more for large-scale exams. And use the allotted resources and no more. So whatever you have, like I said before, it could be about paper or whatever. Make sure that you're using what you have. And the last one is, and this is the most important one for classroom teachers, in my opinion, consider the time and effort to design and score. So if it takes you, like for example, writing multiple choice items, they take time to design well, and we're going to do that in future classes. But if it takes you 4 hours to write all of your multiple choice items, and then it only takes your students 5 minutes to complete, that might not be so practical. And at the same time, if it takes you 10 hours to score all of the essays, maybe that's also not very practical, even though it might be a very effective test type. Okay, so that's practicality. Number 2 is reliability. So reliability means basically the same test given to the same or similar students should produce the same or similar results. Okay, so you don't want to have a test where you give it week 1 and the class average is 95. And then the same test is given to similar English proficient students, they get 55. Then there's something wrong. Okay, so questions you can ask yourself when you create a test to see if it's reliable or not. All right, so let's go through these. Number one, can it be given within appropriate administrative constraints? Okay. 2, is it a dependable test? 3, does it measure what it's meant to measure? This is key. Okay, we're going to talk about this again when we get to the next principle. Is the language on the test authentic? And is useful information provided by the test for the students? So when they get their grades or when they get the feedback, is that actually something that the students can use? Okay, so reliable tests have all of these characteristics or features. So the conditions are consistent over 2 or more times the test is given. Now, conditions could be a lot of things. It could be the classroom is the same, the time is the same, the volume on the CD or the audio file you're playing is the same. Basically, you have to keep everything kind of similar for who's taking the test. Maybe for example, you give the test in the first year and you use English and Chinese to read your instructions. But then the second time you decide, I'm not going to use Chinese this time, I'm only going to use English. Now you've changed the condition and you may get different results. Okay, so the scoring or evaluation directions are clear and unambiguous. And that's not just for the students, but for the teacher as well. So after you receive the test back from the students, you actually know exactly how to score it and what the scores mean. The rubrics for scoring are uniform, okay, so they can't change. And the rubrics can be consistently used by the scorer. So it has to be a rubric. And we talked about this in class. But it has to be a rubric that makes sense and it covers the skills that you're actually testing. And as a scorer, you have to be able to use them in a consistent manner so that from student to student, the scores are not going to fluctuate if their output is basically similar or the same. Okay, the items and the tasks are unambiguous for the test taker. So the test taker has to know what the task is asking and they have to know how to do it. If not, then you're going to get fluctuating output. Okay, now there are different types of reliability that we can look at. And the first is student-related reliability. Now this one obviously is hard for you to control. Students get sick, they get tired. We have anxiety. Anxiety is a very big factor for tests, right? Some students have test anxiety, no matter what the subject is. But some students also have anxiety towards English. So they've got their anxiety about their English level, and they've also got test anxiety. So they might actually be quite good in your class, but when it comes to tests, they might not do very well. So that's something that you can maybe discuss with those particular students. And the other one is test wiseness. So I think most of you probably have learned some strategies for taking tests such as GEPT or TOEIC and how to look for the correct answer and how to look for the incorrect answer. So you have to be very careful when you make tests or you use tests from other companies in that they're not so similar every time that your students start to learn the test and actually they can get a good score even if they may not know the material very well. Okay, another one is rater reliability. Now there's 2 types here that we're going to talk about. The first is inter-rater reliability, and this is when you have more than one person scoring. For your classroom tests, probably this won't be much of an issue. I doubt that you're going to ask other teachers to help you score. But maybe you're asked to judge some kind of writing contest or something like that, and then maybe this will become an issue. But basically, what you want is your 2 raters to have consistent scores. Now, sometimes issues can come if one particular rater doesn't follow the criteria, or maybe you're inexperienced or not paying attention, or you have some kind of biases. If this is a problem, then usually what we'll do is the 2 or 3 raters will have a meeting and discuss how they're going to score them, what things they think are more important, And then also when there are big differences, maybe you will sit down and discuss that particular paper or that particular test and see if you can come to an agreement on changing the score. Okay, now intra-rater reliability, this is more relevant for classroom teachers. And when you're checking, for example, multiple choice tests, is not a problem, right? Because there's only one correct answer, even though you can still make mistakes. But when you're checking essays or paragraphs, something that's subjective, your own personal issues can actually affect the score. So for example, fatigue, that's a real thing. You start to get tired of checking essays. So like for me, when I check essays in writing class here at the university, if I have 30 students, I won't check 30 at one time. There's no way. Once I get through about 10, I really start to lose my focus, and I know that my scores are going to be inconsistent. So I usually make a plan, like how many I'm going to check each day. Now, the problem with that is I might be really tired today, and then maybe I'm grumpy or something's happened to put me in a bad mood, and that can actually affect the way that I score. And then if I check on maybe a Friday afternoon, it's Friday, we're happy, the weekend's coming, I might be more liberal with my scores, maybe, well, who cares, it's Friday. Now, it's not that drastic, but this can happen without you even knowing it. So you have to be really careful. It's possible that teachers have biases to individual students. You have to be really careful about that. And of course, you could just be careless. You're not really checking the answers. You're in a rush and you're going very quickly. Okay. So as I mentioned before, the scoring criteria might actually change while you're checking writing too. So you have your own criteria and you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to check this essay. You check the first essay, you give it a score. Then you check the second one, then you check the third one. But as you're reading them, you start to realize I'm being too easy or I'm being too hard based on the output that I have. And then you will actually start to change the way you score. So a suggestion when you check writing or something more subjective is that you read a lot of the samples first before you start to give them a score. Some people will say you should read half, and that will give you a good idea of what's going to be inside, and that can help your intra-rater reliability. Okay. Another one could be test administration reliability. Sometimes we have no control over these things, but if you do, then be careful. So it could be noise issues. Maybe you're doing a listening test, but there's some construction outside, or there's loud noises going on, or it's not loud enough. Students can't hear in the back corner of the classroom. They can't hear. So you have to really be careful about that. The light in the room, it could be brighter in one spot, darker in another. Maybe when you photocopy the test paper, maybe there are some areas that can't read properly, or maybe this particular student's got ink on it or something, so be careful. And the temperature in the room, right? They're too hot, they can't focus, they're too cold, things like that. And then, of course, it could even just be the desks and chairs, although I doubt that will be much of a problem in your classroom. Okay, then there could be issues with test reliability. So as I mentioned before, if you use multiple choice items, they have to be very carefully designed. And if you don't know how to do it, it could be that your questions are too hard, and so the reliability will be a mess, or they could be too easy. And we're going to talk about multiple choice items in later videos. As I mentioned before, subjective open-ended responses cause unreliability because you are giving your own personal opinion. And I mentioned it in the last slide about how our own opinions can affect the way we give scores. So if you have objective items which have a predetermined correct answer, this can improve reliability, but it can also cause the test to be a little bit less authentic. Okay, and then unreliability can also be caused by ambiguous items. Items with more than one correct answer. Even though you think there's only one correct answer, you have to go through your test items because it's possible that there is more than one correct answer. You have a test with too many items and your test takers will get tired. And so They're not able to focus, they make mistakes, even though maybe they know the answer. And time tests as well. You have some students who are just slow. And I don't mean they're bad learners. They just do things carefully and slowly. And if you don't give them enough time, or you give them time pressure, they get anxiety. And so what happens is they don't actually show you what they're able to do. Okay, so that's it for reliability. The next one now is validity. So by definition, and this is from Gronlund, the extent to which inferences made from assessment results are appropriate, meaningful, and useful in terms of the purpose of the assessment. Okay, so let's break that down. Valid tests measure what they're supposed to measure. Okay, so if I'm testing you on speaking, then I need to give you a test that actually measures your speaking ability. It's basically as simple as that. You don't measure irrelevant variables. So if I'm trying to measure your pronunciation, but I'm actually measuring your grammar and vocabulary at the same time, that's not valid. A valid test will rely as much as possible on empirical evidence. So this is more maybe for standardized exams where they run the test a lot of times and they use statistics to prove that the test is valid and it's testing what it's supposed to test and it's reliable and things like that. The test takers perform tasks that actually match the test criterion. Okay. These tests give us meaningful and valuable information about their ability. So again, I'm testing speaking. After the test, the results that I get really tells me about their speaking ability. And your test is supported by a theoretical rationale, which means someone before has studied this type of test and they've proven or they've shown that this type of test actually measures what I'm trying to measure. So again, I want to give a speaking test. Maybe I don't design my own speaking test the first time. Maybe I do a little research. I read somebody's master's thesis, or I read a journal article where they talk about this type of test is very good for testing speaking. Okay. A valid test of reading measures reading. So here's some points. Not pronunciation, not grammar, not vocabulary. So if you're giving your students a reading test, reading comprehension, their ability to understand, and you ask them to read it out loud, and then you deduct points because they say the words wrong, that's not really testing their reading comprehension. That's their pronunciation. Okay. Now, validity is very difficult to measure or prove. It could be very subjective. And the validity of a test may also concern the consequences of the result. So after you pass the test, what happens? Is it an entrance exam into high school? Is it an entrance exam into an English course, or you want to go abroad, something like that? So are you getting results that match the performance, that match the intended consequences afterwards? Now, there are many types of evidence or validity that we can consider when we're determining the overall validity of your test, and we're going to go through each one. So we have what's called content-related, criterion-related, construct-related, consequential, and face validity, and I'm going to talk about each one. Okay, so the first one is called content-related validity. You should be able to guess what this means just from the title. So the test samples the material that conclusions will be made from, and the students perform the behavior that will be measured. Now, as I mentioned, it's really tough to prove validity, but you should be able to observe if it's valid or not if you clearly define the achievement to be measured. So you have written down what are my objectives and what is it my students are supposed to achieve, and then you give a test and you can see those things happening, then that should be considered valid. The testing performance directly rather than indirectly leads to better content-related validity. So for example, if you're teaching speaking and listening and you give your students a test of grammar, because in speaking, of course, you have to have grammatical accuracy, right? That's one of the key points of communicative competence, is that you have grammar knowledge or language knowledge, and you're able to use it fairly accurately. But it's a pencil and paper test. It's not an actual speaking test, but you're testing what the students know. This is an indirect test of speaking, because I'm not actually having you say the words out loud. I'm having you circle the correct thing the person would say on the paper, or I'm doing a fill in the blank and you have to guess what is, or you have to choose which is the correct word. But it's still paper and pencil. You're not actually saying anything. So it's an indirect way to test speaking, and a lot of people do this to save time. So if you test directly, then that will raise the validity of your test. Okay, the second kind is called Criterion-Related Validity. This is the extent to which the criterion of the test has been reached. And we talked about criterion in the last video. So classroom objectives and preset levels of performance are expected to be met. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you set your criterion at the very beginning and what level students are supposed to get. So they need at least a 60% in this class to pass, or whatever the number is to get into some course. I think like at our school here at NKNU, you have to have like GEPT high intermediate or low intermediate, I forget which one off the top of my head, in order to graduate from the English department. I think it's the high intermediate. Okay, so there are two ways to look at this. There's concurrent and predictive validity. So concurrent validity is that the test results are supported by their actual performance. So you know your students, you know their abilities, and once you give them a test, they actually get the scores that match what their level is. Then that would be a valid test. Okay, the second is predictive validity. For example, if you're giving like a English proficiency test or an entrance test into a program, and they take that test and they score highly, then that's telling us that when they pass that test, they're able to thrive or succeed in the program. So if they take a proficiency test, they score high, and then they go into the program and they do well, then that was very valid. But on the flip side, if they take the test, they get into the program and they fail miserably, well, then the test was not valid because it did not predict their future ability. Okay, the next one is construct validity. This one is a little bit more abstract or a little bit trickier to understand. And to be honest, in your classroom environment, probably it's not something you're always going to think about when you're making your week-to-week tests or your midterm exams. But it's still something that you should think about in terms of assessment overall. So a construct is any theory, hypothesis, or model that attempts to explain observed phenomena in our universe of perceptions. Okay, it's pretty deep definition. But for example, proficiency and communicative competence are examples of linguistic constructs. So that should be pretty easy to think about, right? Proficiency in English or proficiency in speaking. So does your test actually require the test taker to utilize the skills necessary to tap into the theoretical construct it is supposed to? If you're testing about their English proficiency, does your test actually show us what their English proficiency is? Okay, so for example, okay, here's one. You're going to conduct an oral interview with a student or a future worker or something like that. So your scoring criteria includes their pronunciation, their fluency, grammatical accuracy, vocabulary use, and social linguistic appropriateness. Now, why do we choose those 5 scoring criteria? Well, because these are all included in a construct that claims they are essential to oral proficiency. So when we talk about what makes up oral proficiency, not just me, but actual researchers and scholars who have studied this, they agree that these 5 criteria are very important for communicative competence. So if I want to know what your communicative competence is, then I should score all 5, not just your pronunciation or not just your fluency, but all 5 of them together. That would meet the needs of construct validity. Okay, the next one is called consequential validity or impact. So basically, all consequences of a test. So the accuracy in measuring the intended criteria, the effect on students' preparation for the test, and the social consequences of a test implementation and interpretation. So you can think about this one in Taiwan. It's very relevant. How does the entrance exam into high school and how does the entrance exam into university affect the entire social system of Taiwan? It totally changes the education system because teachers change the way they teach, or it affects the way they teach because they're preparing you for a test. And think about all the cram schools that open up to prepare you for these tests. It changes the entire country because of a test. All right, so this is kind of a big deal. Now we can look at this at the macro level or micro level. Macro level is what I just talked about. It affects society and the educational systems. At the micro level, that's in your classroom, we call this washback. And washback is actually the next principle, so I'm not gonna talk about it here. Okay, and the next one is called face validity. I think this is the last one of the validity, types of validity. So this one also, you can't really measure it. It's very subjective, but you can basically say it like this. It looks like a test that measures what it's supposed to measure. So as a test taker, you're being told that you're doing a speaking test, and the things that you're asked to do for you, you agree that that is something that you should do to assess your speaking. Same with administrators, who's giving the test, and the people who are scoring the test. So how can you increase face validity? Well, you use familiar and expected formats and tasks. Don't surprise students with something totally new on the day of the test, something they've never seen before. Tasks that can be finished in the allotted time. It has clear, unambiguous test items, clear, unambiguous directions. Tasks, as I mentioned, that they've actually used before, so they know that it's something that works and they understand. Tasks that are directly related to the course content, and you have to give a reasonable amount of difficulty. Not too hard, but not too easy. If it's too easy, students will feel like, what are you doing? You're wasting my time. If it's too hard, of course, they will give up and they will feel that's not fair, the test that you've given. Okay, so now we're moving on to the 4th principle. Sorry, I said washback is next. Washback is number 5. The 4th one is authenticity. Now this one's tough, because in the classroom, it can be hard to create a test that has tasks which closely resemble something you do in the real world. Like, you don't do spelling tests in the real world. You do spell when you write, and multiple choice questions as well. They're not very authentic. It's not something that is a real world task, typically. Okay, so what can we do, or what are authentic tests? So they are tests which attempt to use natural language. They use contextualized items rather than isolated ones. They have meaningful, relevant topics. They utilize a connected theme or topic through the test. So it's not just 6 individual top sections on a test that have nothing to do with each other, but you try to connect all the items throughout the test. And you can do this by telling a story or creating some theme in which all of the sections kind of connect to each other with the vocabulary, with the grammar, and so the students are actually completing something more meaningful. You can use tasks that can be done outside of the classroom. All right. So authenticity, just before I move on to washback, authenticity can be a tricky one, especially when the questions are already created. So this is something we'll talk about more in the classroom. And when I ask you to create your own test items, then maybe we can discuss ways to make it a little bit more authentic. Okay, now the last one is washback. So I talked about this in the consequential validity or impact. Basically, it's how testing affects teaching and learning. Okay, now there are what we call types of positive washback, but there's also negative washback. And I'll give you an example of negative washback first. And I think this is my own personal opinion, that the negative washback of the entrance exams is that teachers teach students how to pass the test, because students need to get a good score on the test in order to get into a good school. And so, of course, the teacher wants to help you. But the negative washback, and I can think of two right off the top of my head. The first is that teachers compete with each other in order to have classes of students who have better scores. So they can say, look at my students, they all got A++, 5 A++s, and now they're going to the best school in the country. And they can tell the principal that and their directors. And so actually teachers may not work together because of this competitive nature. And the even bigger problem is, especially for subjects like English, but all subjects really, is that the teachers are focused on that test so much that they're not really teaching English as a language. They're teaching English as how to pass the English test. And so students aren't able to really use the language in an authentic way. They have tons of knowledge about English, but maybe they're not sure how to use it to communicate. But that's what we want in Taiwan, right? We're talking about bilingual Taiwan 2030. We want our students to be able to communicate in English, use English for authentic purposes. And so this is what I consider to be a major issue, in that tests are controlling the way that we teach. And it shouldn't be that. Tests should be a way to show what students have learned. Okay, so let's look at some beneficial washback. So we want to make a test that helps teachers or causes teachers to be positively influenced on how and what they teach. Okay, students also positively influence on how and what they learn. So again, this type of test where students are memorizing vocabulary and memorizing grammar, it's not really a way that's conducive for using English as a language instead of a subject. But if we can create tests, like for example, in university, maybe you have to prepare for an oral interview. Well, now you're preparing how to actually use the language for a real interview. And that is something that you will do outside of the class. Then that's a little bit more positive washback. Okay, students are able to adequately prepare for the test. So that's another type of good washback. And students receive feedback that actually promotes improved learning. So feedback is something that's really important. We're going to talk about that later. But it can't just be something like a score. That might not improve my learning. Maybe I need to know specifically what I need to work on. Okay, and that's it, everybody. So we're going to stop here. The next video for this chapter is going to focus more on actually how to use these principles in test design, and should we care about all 5 of them when we're making our tests? If we want to have authenticity, does that affect the other ones? If I want to have validity, does that affect the other ones? And so we're going to discuss that more. All right, thank you everyone for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.